on a Monday, there's a suicide bomb. Everybody loves Israel. On a Tuesday, Israel goes in for retaliation, kills children and does other dreadful atrocities. Israel is the terrible person. There's no point in that. It's not going to lead to anything.
There is a huge distortion in the media here. Actually, they are looking for violence only. They are looking for bloodshed, and they are looking for headlines. They don't go behind the headlines. They don't want to know the roots of the problem. They are not concentrating on the daily living of 3 million Palestinians suffocated by the Israeli sanctions.
How often does the media tell the whole story? The process of how we get there is absolutely a crucial piece. And so often that's missed out. We just get facts without context.
But if you actually watch the way this dispute is reported, it would appear to be a struggle between two equal sides, more or less, two sides who both have right on their side and both have wrong on their side, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Two forces, as they're often described, struggling over the same bit of land. Well, this is a gross oversimplification in my view.
The real influence of the media is not in articles. It is in the way you write the news, the terminology of the news, the angle of reporting. The media report things which happen. If you don't kill somebody, you are not news.
It's one of the most important stories in television news, the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. And enormous amounts of care and attention are devoted to reporting it accurately and fairly.
But increasingly, that coverage is subject to a litany of criticism and complaints. Reports presented to the viewing public as balanced, neutral and objective contain hidden omissions and biases.
In this film, we're going to point out some of the important distinctions, and we provide some examples of a more creative approach suitable for a television news programme serving a general audience.
We begin with two very different versions of the same story, a story which highlights a number of crucial issues in the theory and practice of reporting conflict.
Hello and welcome to News from the Holy Land. I'm Annabel McGoldrick.
And I'm Jake Lynch. These few square miles must be among the most bitterly contested patches of ground anywhere on Earth, and the events that take place here are certainly some of the most intensively reported by the world's media.
Above all, it's the regular exchanges of violence that make the headlines, like the horrifying suicide bombing that took place in Israeli West Jerusalem in August 2003. Jake's report begins from the scene of the explosion.
Carnage on the streets of Jerusalem, the worst suicide bombing here in more than a year. Israelis despairing now that they can ever be safe in their homes. Members of this Orthodox Jewish community have already raised calls for Arabs to be forcibly moved out of East Jerusalem, the border just a few hundred yards from the scene of the blast. Rescue workers pulling survivors from the wreckage and collecting whatever traces they could find of the dead. This, the man responsible for the horror, a 29-year-old schoolteacher from Hebron. The extremist group Hamas sent him out to kill, in revenge, they said, for attacks on their leaders, and to send a message: no compromise in peace talks with the Israelis.
The dialogue among Palestinians is the key element of our strength, and nobody can stop this dialogue unless he is intending to break the Palestinian unity.
Today, the numbingly familiar routines of mourning. They're calling it the massacre of the children. A high proportion of the victims were under 10 years old, returning from the old city where they'd gone to pray with their parents. Their killer had disguised himself as one of them. He was strapped into a massive bomb packed with fragments of metal to inflict the maximum deadly effect.
There is no doubt that decisions will be made today. Already we have closed the Palestinian areas, and we will postpone the transfer of Palestinian cities to the Palestinian Authority. But the Israeli government will have to decide how to further react to this wanton act of terrorism.
Israel's President Moshe Katsav visiting the wounded in hospital. Israel has already announced a suspension of all contacts with the Palestinians as she mulls over possible military reprisals. This devastating blow shattered a period of relative calm here, when progress on the latest peace plan, the American-sponsored roadmap, began to seem possible. Now any prospect of peace between Israelis and Palestinians appears as faint and distant as it's ever been. It all leaves Abu Mazen, the beleaguered Palestinian Prime Minister, unsure which way to turn. He's facing renewed demands to crack down on militant groups. Whether he's strong enough to do it, many here doubt. Well, that's a fairly standard report on a violent incident of the kind that have kept on winding up this conflict in recent years. It tells us broadly what we'd expect from a news report, the who, what, where, when and how of what happened. But there's another question journalists are supposed to answer, the why. Annabel reports now from the scene of the blast in West Jerusalem.
Another day of mourning in Jerusalem. A bus carrying families back from a prayer visit to the old city when the bomb went off. A high proportion of those killed were children, as if to emphasise the indiscriminate power of this conflict to destroy the lives and hopes of young and old alike. The blast confirmed the end of a ceasefire by the militant groups Islamic Jihad and Hamas. The 6-week truce was supposed to create space for the latest peace plan, the American-sponsored roadmap, but progress has been slow and now risks going into reverse.
There is no doubt that decisions will be made today. Already we have closed the Palestinian areas and we will postpone the transfer of Palestinian cities to the Palestinian Authority. But the Israeli government will have to decide how to further react to this wanton act of terrorism.
Palestinians today dreading renewed military action, like this raid in Gaza recently that killed 8 civilians. Even after last night's attack, the Palestinian death toll from the violence of recent years is 3 times that among Israelis, with 21 killed in the ceasefire period alone. This hospital at Kalkilia is one that's had to pick up the pieces.
Live bullets injury, explosive bullets injury, even some explosions. We have received some injuries with explosions. We were obliged to deal with all of these cases, even if the trauma and the injury was too difficult for us.
The Israelis and Palestinians are now trapped in a cycle of violence. The elaborate security and military apparatus designed to protect Israel inflicts a steady trickle of casualties on the Palestinians. And every time the Palestinians lash out, as one did here, there's a crackdown, which makes the conditions in which they live still more onerous. Many of those deaths and injuries come in shooting incidents at army checkpoints, set up to enforce Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory. These women from Checkpoint Watch carry out daily monitoring visits. Without any effective oversight, they say, shootings take place with impunity.
The army claims that the youngster, a 14-year-old fellow, threw a stone at them or talked to them in a rude way or something. We left 10 minutes earlier, and they shot the fellow. The boy, it's a boy, he's 14 years old, it's a child. They shot him and killed him.
Israel's government has responded to the suicide bombing by breaking off talks with the Palestinians. But many here are calling for renewed urgency in the political process as the only way to remove the causes of violence.
The twisted skeleton of a bus blown up by a suicide bomber. An image so powerfully evocative that many Israelis believe the world has only to see it to sympathise automatically with any steps they take to protect themselves. But Carol Sansur of the Bethlehem Media Centre told me that without context, reports of suicide bombings and the damage and destruction they cause amount to an unfair representation of the conflict.
It's definitely unfair to the Palestinians because I think an attack or a suicide attack or a bombing that takes off or a shooting that takes off or happens from the Palestinian side towards the Israeli side does not happen in a vacuum. I mean, there is a process that leads to such a happening, and this process is often denied or not mentioned in the mainstream media.
That's what happened here in Shmuel Hanavi, an Orthodox Jewish neighbourhood of Jerusalem and scene of the attack in August 2003. My report is typical of the way many international media presented it, as bringing to an end a period of calm in which progress on peace talks began to seem possible. But as Annabel's piece makes clear, the steady trickle of Palestinian casualties continued, below the radar of many news desks and reporters.
The point of showing army checkpoints in my report is not to downplay the suffering of Israelis, but to add that element of context, vital to understanding why the violence keeps happening. Israel's military occupation means Palestinians are blocked and frustrated in many aspects of everyday life.
Coming to work, to hospitals, to visit families, to study, to do, someone is going to meet his wife who is delivering a baby in the hospital, and they are not allowed to pass because the law today, just today, is only under 16 years old and over 35 years old. And all these people are in between, and they are not allowed.
Gabrielle Rifkin runs the Middle East Policy Initiatives Forum in London. She's also a trained psychotherapist. The exchanges of violence, lopsided as they are, take on a life of their own, hardening and polarising the conflict, an effect exacerbated, she says, when they're reported without context or anything to encourage understanding of the other side.
People no longer become human beings on the other side. They just become people to blame and to dump all the problems on, and the whole notion of any kind of relationship breaks down, and that feeds polarisation. So you get two sides in opposite camps with very, very little potential of kind of bridging in between or in any kind of linking that makes the kind of human contact that's necessary if we're talking about preparing for peace.
But the cycle of violence cannot by itself explain the conflict. When we visited the checkpoint at Beit Farik near Nablus, the individual soldiers behaved with consideration and restraint, here effectively defusing an argument with a young man in the queue before it turned nasty. Showing the checkpoint watch women offers an image to break up the pattern of polarisation, where everyone's on one side or the other. But they also draw attention to what's called structural violence, showing how the conflict is embedded in a system of relations, a system which sets people against each other. Perth, capital of Western Australia, and a chance to catch up with Johan Galtung, a founder of peace studies and peace research. That influential concept of structural violence is his, and Israel's military occupation of Palestinian territory, he told me, is a good example.
An army is a very strong structure, filled with rewards and punishments, and a very strong culture associated with it, of patriotism, nationalism of all kinds, and in the Israeli case, of course, also the theocratic aspect of Judaism. So if you look at all of this, it's enough to take the individual soldier off the hook, to take him and her off, and to, in a sense, tell the Palestinians, and the Palestinians telling themselves, this may still be a good guy, but there is something wrong with the structure and culture.
There's a risk, of course, in highlighting the structural violence of the occupation and its consequences as an explanation for suicide bombings, as the Prime Minister's wife, Sherry Booth, discovered a couple of years ago.
As long as young people feel they've got no hope but to blow themselves up, we're never going to make progress, are we?
Any suggestion that killing people can be excused as entirely due to circumstances risks adding to polarisation by making the aggrieved party feel their suffering is not being taken seriously, as happened on this occasion. So how does a news programme avoid the two extremes of demonising the perpetrator on the one hand and excuse-making on the other? Well, we've seen the different ways now to cover a single traumatic event in the conflict, like the suicide bombing in Jerusalem. We've seen the options for a reporter and the possible consequences. But what about the deeper underlying processes that drive the cycle of violence? Here's Jake.
Recycling broken glass into art, a rare creative outlet for young people in Bethlehem. The organiser Amer Darahmeh, a peace and community activist whose group is called simply Palestinian Vision. This is the way we work here, he says. We share everything and we try to create something out of nothing. The destructive side of Palestinian youth, a suicide bombing in Jerusalem. This attack in March last year claimed 10 Israeli lives. Pictures of the perpetrator appeared on posters from the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. And one of them is on the wall in the home Amer shares with his wife and baby son, because the bomber Mohammed was his 18-year-old brother. How did he come to follow such a different path?
Each stage of the struggle has its own different form of resistance. Once it meant violent retaliation for Israeli attacks on us Palestinians. But violence just creates more violence. We want a different future, and that's why we're working. That's the reason why I exist, so as to help create a better future for the kids here.
At the time, refugee camps like the one where Amer lives were under attack by Israeli tanks and jets, which killed 30 Palestinians. Over the years, he told me he'd seen too many people killed and the grief of those left behind. For Mohammed, the violence brought back a terrible memory of when his best friend was shot and died in his arms.
It's the death of his friend next to him. That really was the turning point in Mohammed's life.
Amer and the boy's mother described a mild young man who loved children and graduated successfully from technical school, certainly not the stereotyped religious fanatic. I challenged them, did they ever think of Mohammed's victims?
Everyone's child is precious to its parents, the way my kids are precious to me. Their kids are precious to them as well. I didn't expect my son to do this, or I would have tried to stop him.
It seems shocking to outsiders, but many Palestinians do see suicide bombers like Mohammed as heroes of the struggle. His brother Amer offers a very different role model, trying to bring hope to young people in Bethlehem of a future and a life worth living. Opinion polls show Palestinians are now in favour of a ceasefire, as long as there's no return of Israeli heavy armour to their streets, and they're keen for some renewed prospect of political progress. As for Amer himself, he's just raised his stake in a peaceful tomorrow. Amer's story could be a follow-up to the initial report on the suicide bombing, part of a creative strategy for a news programme committed to giving viewers the means to make sense of traumatic events which dominate the headlines. He didn't experience his friend being shot in front of him, as his brother did, but the pair shared essentially the same background. Only one turned to violence, so it can be explained without being excused. It was important to use the stand-up or piece-to-camera to restore an outside perspective, and to challenge them on camera about Mohammed's victims. It also shows someone else, on the Palestinian side this time, working for peace.
There is a huge need of work to be done internally, and I think Amer is doing it the right way, whereby people are more and more, through expressing their anger, expressing their fears and hopes for the future, are capable of trying to share it with others and understand that others also have fears and hope for the future.
Viewers who only see images of violence on their television screens probably don't realise that a substantial constituency for peace exists among both Israelis and Palestinians. While we were in Bethlehem filming with Amer, an opinion poll revealed for the first time that the armed uprising or intifada against the Israeli occupation had lost majority support among Palestinians.
The majority of Palestinians, 44.5%, they're asking for halting the intifada, and it's the majority, and only 42% is said we are with continuation of the intifada. You know, this number has changed. I mean, compared to last poll, we did it around 60% of Palestinians support the continuation of the intifada.
The people whose words and deeds make the news about this conflict tend to be either political leaders or men with guns. But their familiar demands and positions can hide interesting facts about public opinion and what people might be prepared to accept as a way forward towards resolving some of the issues. Annabelle's been to find out more.
השבוע נשלחת לכל בית בישראל הצעת הסכם ז'נבה.
Publicity for peace. Israelis are reading about a new political plan and hearing radio ads urging their support. Its name, the Geneva Accord.
מוגש מטעם מטה יוזמת ז'נבה.
Palestinians are learning about the plan from their newspapers, as I discovered when I went to Ramallah. One of its authors, a former minister in Yasser Arafat's Palestinian Authority, showed me the special supplement distributed to newsagents and the map delineating the two states, one Israeli, one Palestinian, which form the basis of this draft agreement.
We are saying here, peace is possible. Here is a proof that it is possible. And partnership for that peace is also possible. And here is a proof for it.
A few miles away, the Jewish settlement of Beit El, deep inside the occupied West Bank. Built on land seized from Palestinian villagers, the settlements are seen as illegal under international law. The plan calls for them to be emptied, with the homes earmarked for Palestinian refugees.
If the Arabs would realize that the Jews are here to stay and we're not going anywhere, and they could live in peace with us. I don't want to throw them into the ocean. I don't want to bomb them. I don't want anything like that. I think that's the only way to peace. I can accept them being wherever they want to be, and they have to accept me the way I am, wherever I want to be.
The Geneva Accord calls for up to 200,000 men and children to be uprooted from their homes in places like this. For a government to do that would involve a major political commitment and almost certainly a great deal of anguish for Israel as a whole. The streets of Tel Aviv. Here and in other cosmopolitan cities of Israel's Mediterranean coast, the settlements seem a world away. And opinion polls suggest more and more Israelis are now prepared to abandon them as a price worth paying for peace.
The question is, should or should not Israel agree to evacuate most of the settlements as a part or within a permanent peace agreement with the Palestinians? Now, the latest poll we took was last week, and we found that 62% of the Israeli agreed to this.
In Jerusalem, the Haram al-Sharif, Islam's third holiest shrine, would be under Palestinian sovereignty, while the Wailing Wall, for Jews, the origin of all creation, which lies just in front of it, would be Israeli. The hardest thing for Palestinians to swallow would be an end to the automatic right of return for the refugees of 1948. They were driven from their homes in what's now Israel when the Jewish state was formed. The Geneva Accord has no official status, but its authors say they're confident of winning the arguments among both peoples over time.
Among Israelis, one way of seeing the politics of the conflict is as a debate between hope and fear. Some say the occupation cannot possibly be the real explanation for violence because Palestinian attacks against Jewish civilians in the Holy Land have been going on for decades, so ending the occupation would not remove the danger.
Israelis have a pretty good sense of history. They know this conflict didn't start 3 years ago or even in 1967, that settlements and occupation are symptoms of the conflict and they're excuses, but the violence and the terrorism goes back, if you will, to 1929 when the Jewish community was destroyed and massacred in Hebron, or in 1947 with the passage of the UN partition resolution when we had car bombs and similar types of terror attacks, or all of the wars, the Arab-Israeli wars that have been waged since 1948.
But the poll findings in my report in favour of dismantling the illegal settlements suggest most Israelis do understand their security depends on creating a just peace with the Palestinians.
Uri Avneri, veteran leader of Israel's peace movement, represents the voice of hope in this equation. Over many years, he's observed the dynamics of political violence from several different perspectives.
I was a terrorist when I was very young, and against the British. And I do, from my own experience, I do understand how this kind of thing works.
Avneri fought for the creation of a Jewish state against the British colonial powers in the years following World War II. Since then, he's won the Right Livelihood Award, the alternative Nobel Peace Prize, for his leadership of Gush Shalom, a committed advocate of a fully fledged, independent Palestinian state to match. In practice, he told me, that would see the violence against Israeli civilians rapidly winding down.
This kind of action is totally dependent on the public mood. No organization commits acts in order to to become unpopular. They do acts in order to become popular.
Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, too, is committed, at least notionally, to an independent Palestinian state, and he refers occasionally to painful concessions Israel may have to make under the American-sponsored roadmap. The chances for any peace plan, however, must be gauged not in agreements initialed by leaders, but in the lived experience of people affected by the conflict.
One way to get beyond the familiar picture of two great antagonists battling for advantage is to report on the reality of life for those caught up in the conflict, Israelis and Palestinians who live with it day in, day out. Here's Annabel.
Reality on the ground is now assuming a new and even more divisive pattern than before. Israel's building a so-called security fence. Everyone else calls it simply the wall. It's intended to control the movement of Palestinians in the occupied West Bank. It means farmers can end up separated from their lands. Naim Hassan Shawani runs a nursery near the town of Kalkilia. Access to his crops, he told me, now depends on daily decisions by Israeli soldiers to let him through or not.
If 2 days or 3 days I can't enter, what will happen to the nursery? There are small plants in small boats. Every day you want to give them water.
Another farmer showed me 3 separate passes he now needs to go about his daily business. Kalkilia is virtually surrounded by the wall. He's allowed to pass through it via this gate and this gate alone. The town is also home to Palestine's only zoo. The owner told me how it's clung rather desperately to existence through the intifada of the last 3 years. The zebras succumbed to tear gas, and one of the giraffes panicked at the sound of gunfire, hit his head, keeled over and died. His mate miscarried their calf. Above all, it's short of people, and now the wall makes it virtually impossible for visitors to come here.
We lose too much here. You ask me about the future also. More people before came to the zoo here. Now you can see this empty, nobody.
Watching the cage lioness, it's difficult not to see the zoo as a symbol of the situation facing the town's inhabitants. The zoo here at Kalkilia keeps going on a wing and a prayer, but the Palestinians who come here to peer through the bars of the cages are themselves now being shut in. Their fields and their homes are being surrounded by a ring of concrete and steel. It's not the economic effect of the wall, but its political effect, both here in Kalkilia and along its entire length, that's seen it condemned by the UN and the United States as an obstacle to peace.
It's making the facts on the ground, which not only the building of the wall, but the buttressing of seized land by enhancing Jewish settlements, so much intermingled with Palestinian communities that the idea of separating the Palestinians from the Israelis, establishing 2 states, becomes virtually impossible to do.
Israel says the wall's needed to keep suicide bombers at bay. The Palestinian Authority, it argues, is unable or unwilling to do so.
The Israeli public says this is a situation which is chronic, which is in an overboiling under pressure for many, many years, and the best way is to build the strongest wall we can against it because nothing else is going to prevent those attacks. There is no political solution out there that will succeed in preventing it because those people want to see us destroyed.
But some victims of the conflict say only political progress and not physical barriers will keep Israelis safe. Robbie Daimlin's son David was part of an army patrol, gunned down while guarding a Jewish settlement in the occupied West Bank.
If somebody wants to do something and is so humiliated that he doesn't care whether he survives or not, he'll get through and he'll do what it is he wants to do. And what you're doing by building these fences is simply creating more enemies.
The scene of the latest suicide bombing, This restaurant in Haifa was attacked by a Palestinian woman whose brother and fiancé had both been killed. The first thing she did when leaving home was to pass through the wall.
These two reports on the effect of the wall on everyday life for Palestinians and the prospects for the Geneva Accord represents options for news programmes to follow up on coverage of a violent incident. In the process, they inform us about some of the basic facts: the thousands of Israeli settlers living illegally on occupied land, the Palestinians made refugees when the State of Israel was formed in 1948. Greg Philo is director of the Glasgow University Media Group and one of Britain's leading figures in critical media studies. His book, Bad News from Israel, chronicles his findings from polls and focus groups about what viewers actually know after so much coverage of the conflict in their news in recent years.
There's enormous confusion over who the settlers are, about what the territories are, about what the occupation means. I mean, a large number of people believe that the occupation meant simply that the land was occupied by somebody. So many people thought it was the Palestinians who were occupying the occupied territories, in the way that a bathroom's occupied or something like that. They just thought it meant people were there.
By focusing on violent incidents, news programmes not only perpetuate a pattern of polarisation, they also leave audiences misinformed about basic facts. But providing context is difficult, partly because representations of the conflict are themselves so contested. Which bit of context do you take?
At first, the Lebanese soldiers' move south went well.
Reporting from Lebanon, the voice of Tim Llewellyn, for many years a BBC correspondent in the Middle East. For him, the basic mistake many journalists make is to see the conflict as pitting two equal parties against each other. A more accurate parallel, he told me, would be with the apartheid regime in South Africa.
Everybody knew that apartheid was a bad thing. It was contrary to moral and international law. And it was reported as that. I mean, the nationalists had their spokesman, they had a voice naturally, and people made attempts to explain why they were the way they were. But that isn't being done, in my view, in Israel, in the dispute with the Palestinians. It's not being presented as what it is, in fact, violation of international law, a violation of people's rights, ethnic cleansing.
So where do the responsibilities of broadcasters lie? The BBC, like its counterparts at ITN and Sky News, is governed by public service obligations. They're translated into journalese in a document called Producer Guidelines. One of them stipulates that no significant perspective should go unreported or underrepresented on the BBC. Another says there are usually more than two sides to any issue. And a third, perhaps most important, tells editors and their teams that all views should be reflected to mirror the depth and spread of opinion.
The question is, which opinion? It can't possibly mean opinion in Israel, and given the BBC's profile as a global news organisation on a story of such international significance, surely the only sensible interpretation would be world opinion. And the vast majority of world political, legal and public opinion sees Israel's military occupation of Palestinian territory as the main problem.
Israelis who oppose the occupation and try to advocate a peace based on human rights and the rule of law should play a much bigger part in the news than they do, not only because there are more than two sides to any issue, but also because they are much more in line with global public opinion than their own government.
This is the occupation, this is the cancer which kills both societies, the Palestinian and the Israelis. We must get rid of this cancer. So whatever you do in order to get rid from this cancer, bless you.
And we should hear much more about the majority of Palestinians who see no need for more violence, but instead want a renewed political process, with the Geneva Accord or something very like it as the way forward. Ofcom, the new communications regulator, is in charge of commercial broadcasters like Sky and ITN. They too enjoy a rising international profile, and they must abide by public service obligations set out in a programme code. In dealing with major matters of controversy, it says, licensees must ensure that justice is done to a full range of significant views and perspectives. The trouble is, some views and perspectives tend to dominate even if they're not representative. The day-to-day machinery of news means that leaders with their fixed positions and men with guns usually hog the headlines. If left unattended, a pattern of omission and distortion tends to prevail by default. So, audiences are not properly informed. To prevent this, a deliberate, creative strategy is needed.
It doesn't apply just in Britain. The rules for Australian broadcasters can be interpreted as conferring similar obligations. The ABC's editorial policies, for instance, say balance should be achieved by presenting a wide range of perspectives. In serving the public's right to know, editorial staff will be enterprising in perceiving, pursuing and presenting issues which affect society and the individual. Pursuing impartiality should not mean endorsing the status quo. The ABC seeks to be a pace-setter in community discussion.
So often, reports of this conflict can seem like Groundhog Day. Audiences turn off because it's always the same. But news is supposed to be about change. We pick up today's paper to find out what's changed since yesterday. Perhaps the lesson is to find the sources of change, we need to cast the net a little wider. This conflict is always reported as Israelis versus Palestinians. It's almost as if every single Palestinian hates every single Israeli, and every single Israeli hates every single Palestinian. So they're each ready to pick up a gun and fight a battle to the end. But it's not that simple. Here's Jake.
Israeli soldiers at a checkpoint in the occupied West Bank, checking identity papers of villagers on their way to the Palestinian city of Nablus. Israel says it needs to control people's movements for its own security, but it's these duties that a growing number of Israelis are now refusing to carry out. Adam Maor, at home with his parents in Haifa on a weekend break from military detention, faces up to 3 years in jail for disobeying orders.
Keeping checkpoints, not letting people get out to work, getting into houses to look for armed men and all of that. You cannot do that and let the Palestinians keep the ordinary life.
Instead, Adam wants to study music at college in Jerusalem. He'd get away with it if a doctor pronounced him unfit to serve, or if he quietly objected as a pacifist. It's his highly public opposition to Israel's military occupation that's got him and 5 other young refuseniks into trouble.
I think it's very bad that he's going to prison because he's got the courage to say what others don't.
Adam and his friends have done very brave things, and the voice are being heard, and it's very important, and I'm really, really proud of him.
A military court in Jaffa, and the first of these cases to be decided. Yoni Ben-Artzi was tried separately because he's refused all army service. Yoni's uncle is Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's hardline former prime minister.
I guess he also does respect a person's right for his belief and as a result of that, to be exempt from military service.
The court has yet to pass sentence, but Yoni's case has highlighted a growing divide among Israelis, the fault line running through his own family.
Maybe more and more people will be convinced that there is another way. After all, that what Yoni is talking about is a different culture, a culture of peace, a culture of compromise.
The army has argued that the refuseniks are not really pacifists at all. Pacifism, they say, is personal and private, not public and political. Their fear is that hundreds, even thousands of other young Israelis will follow their example and start disobeying their military orders as well. The challenge is to build a framework of understanding in which the relevancy of individual actions to the larger narratives of the conflict and the process of political change can be made clear to viewers. To do that is, inevitably, to amplify their effect, if only by encouraging those who do them. But to ignore them is not to remain neutral. Not only does it give a distorted picture, it's also to collude in concealing them from view.
The citizen is completely helpless. He does not hear any other voice. And if everybody says the same, it must be true. And in this respect, the press in Israel, not the press, the media, the total media, have played a very, very faithful role. I personally blame them for all the killing which is going on.
So what are the connections here? How does the coverage offered by international media, British media say, influence the behaviour of parties to the conflict, including third parties like the British government?
The people of this country are not being properly informed, and therefore if the people are not being properly informed, they're not going to care about putting pressure on their own government to try and make some sort of difference, I don't know, in the council chambers of Europe or in trying to induce the Americans to change their attitude. You don't get a proper debate if you're not properly informed. It's as simple as that.
Ramallah in the West Bank and the ruined presidential compound of Yasser Arafat. For the Palestinians, to have an elected leader and a governing authority was the vision underpinning the Oslo Accords. To walk round it, as I did, is to contemplate how far that vision has crumbled since it was first conceived. The Israelis say they found papers here linking Arafat to the suicide bombers. They razed it almost to the ground. This was the centrepiece of Britain's investment through the European Union in political infrastructure. Critics say British government should be far more outspoken about Israeli violence.
This distortion actually creating more despair among the Palestinian people. You know, the Palestinian people, they feel that they were left by the international community. They are ignored. Their suffering is not really making the right impact, and nobody is helping them, especially in this country, in Britain. They expect the British government, which promised several times to actually use its special relationship to find a solution for the Arab-Israeli conflict. They feel the British government let them down.
Pressure groups in London bringing together Israelis and Palestinians have been advocating different forms of intervention. They're based on the idea of peace enforcement to create space for progress on political initiatives, presently a hostage to incidents of violence and the mutual loathing they leave behind.
In a very ugly divorce, you have to have third-party intervention. You have to have a lawyer, you have to have legal arbitration that says, let's separate these people out, let's cool them off, we will move in between to hold the peace at this moment until temperatures have lowered. And I think you could actually parallel that to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
Above all, that would mean demilitarising the occupied territories, including the removal of Israeli army checkpoints, the system which is the engine of so much tension and strife. The way a problem is diagnosed affects what we're prepared to see as an appropriate remedy. Crucially, it's only if the occupation itself is seen as the main problem that a political space will open up for any really effective third-party intervention.
As long as the population think that occupation means like a bathroom is occupied, as long as they don't understand who's occupying who or what's happened or why it's happened or why any of this is going on, then there is never going to be any serious public discussion about how to resolve it.
News tells us the way it is, but it needs to get better at telling us how it came to be that way. Too often we're left to infer that hatred between Israelis and Palestinians is inevitable, welling up naturally from within. So the best we can hope for is to maintain what a British Home Secretary once called, in a different though somewhat similar context, an acceptable level of violence. To avoid that trap, we need to find ways to show how mutual suspicion and misperceptions are being constructed, and how relations between people could be constructed differently.
Now, it's sometimes said the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world, and the enmity between Israelis and Palestinians is something that's inculcated from early in life. But some on either side are working to change that, as Annabelle's been finding out.
A workshop at the School of Arts in Israeli West Jerusalem. But these 15-year-olds are not learning painting or sculpture. Instead, they're redesigning their own perceptions of their place in society and the values important to them.
Values like freedom, liberty, equality, powers divided in our society, these kind of values, and we try to rethink these basic values in our society as really a first step of thinking about conflict.
Thousands of students, Israeli and Palestinian, have now taken these lessons in peace education. Part of it's helping them to understand the conflict here as a shared problem. These youngsters see it as something which takes away the freedoms of people on both sides.
In Israel, it's kind of hard to go out with friends, and you're always afraid something will happen.
And they can't choose where to live. They want to live here maybe, and we put them in their own places. They can't choose where to be or what to do because they're like locked up.
It's a gentle antidote to the fear and suspicion that can easily develop in a situation where day-to-day contact between Israelis and Palestinians is minimal. Have you met a Palestinian?
No, not yet. And not that I want to really, but I don't mind. I wouldn't mind meeting a Palestinian.
Talk to Israelis and Palestinians about the conflict here, and they'll tell you that the main underlying problem is one of mutual mistrust. People like this are quietly preparing communities for the moment when they'll have to trust each other, when they decide to jump together into the unknown to create a peaceful shared future. Teachers in the programme come together to break bread at a restaurant in Galilee. A rare contact between professionals from Israel's Arab and Jewish communities. The aim is to unravel the harmful stereotypes taking shape from an early age.
Most of the materials now in Israel, until now, even the curriculum at schools, describe the Arabs as an enemy, as ugly, as quite not a human being.
The project's directors told me each participant is brought to look on himself or herself as both part of the problem and part of the solution.
We suggest and we offer to start a journey which will examine our own values and our own opinions and our own attitudes and our own behavior and context. So we'll say, let's start with ourselves. Then from ourselves we will go a little bit farther to a second circle and a third circle, and then we will go on talking about the other, the enemy.
Only then, they believe, will peace agreements signed by leaders on both sides actually change the picture on the ground.
To criticise coverage of news from the Holy Land, as we've done in this film, is not to play a blame game. Jerusalem bureaus are staffed by some of the most astute and conscientious journalists in the business, and programmes produced in the UK's television newsrooms are among the most admired in the world. To see problems as the fault only of individuals would be as misguided here as in discussions of the conflict itself.
Those problems are built in to the everyday routines of journalism in a conflict zone. It means that the best of intentions can sometimes bring unintended consequences. Journalists concerned to be fair and objective can find themselves sticking to safe stories, to big bangs and the agendas set by official sources. To do otherwise, may feel, could leave them open to criticism and complaints.
What we've tried to illustrate here are the options for covering this important story after several years of a narrative composed almost entirely of violent exchanges.
An approach which presents itself as just reporting the facts. But as we've shown, it's not free of consequences. Instead, journalists are caught up, whether they like it or not, in the loops and coils of conflict and political process.
The cumulative patterns of omission and distortion represent an abrogation of broadcasters' responsibility to their audiences, and they exert a distorting effect on the discussion we should be having about how to achieve progress towards a lasting peace. There's now a strong case for a change of direction.